mine. I'm going to talk about a meta-research study that I conducted focused on our field, and in particular, looking at diversity and inclusion within our samples. And I was motivated to conduct this research, first of all, just because this is a big issue in psychological science in general, right? So since the Weirdest People in the World paper came out in 2010, which highlighted the fact that most of psychological science has been conducted on a fairly limited subset of people. And so over the ensuing decades since then, many other areas of psychological science have been looking at themselves, with a critical eye towards this issue. And in fact, there's actually some invited sessions later this week at SPSP about this type of meta-research that's been conducted in other fields. So this is a general issue in psychology. And, I don't think there's any reason to believe that relationship science is the one area that's immune from this problem. In fact, if any of you are like me, then the lack of diversity in our field is something that you've maybe sensed and noticed. So for example, here at UT, our undergraduate students are very diverse. And when I teach courses on intimate relationships, they always have lots of questions about, whether the things that I'm telling them do they hold true for, people from this background or people in this type of relationship. They want to know those sorts of things. And more often than not, the answer I have to give them is that we just don't know. We don't know if it generalizes or not. So if we want to join the rest of psychological science in taking a critical eye towards our field, understanding the ways in which our knowledge might be limited by the types of samples that we've been studying, then of course, like good scientists, we need data in order to do this. And so what I thought we needed was a baseline measure of how we're doing right now, so that as we move forward, we can look back, we can compare to it, and see if we make improvements. And we also need something to guide that move forward, right? So what are the things that we need to do? What are the areas that we need to focus on? So I decided to survey the recent literature in our field, then to give us this data about where we're at right now. And so this review focuses on 3 aims. So first of all, I just wanted to give us some really clear descriptive data on what exactly our samples look like in regards to demographic diversity and inclusion of underrepresented groups. And then beyond that, for the papers that are focused on underrepresented groups, I wanted to know what kind of methodology is being used and what kinds of questions are being asked in these studies. So for papers that focus on underrepresented groups, are our best relationship science methods being used? Are we doing observational studies? Are we doing longitudinal studies? And when people are collecting samples of underrepresented groups, what types of questions are they pursuing? So are people only pursuing these samples when they want to study something specific and particular about that group? Or when they want to, replicate or test generalizability, or are people actually pursuing novel research questions when studying underrepresented groups? So by addressing those 3 aims, I hope to give us the information that we need as a field, to move relationship science forward. So I'm going to tell you about the results of this comprehensive review, then I'm going to conclude with a few recommendations and ideas. So to address those 3 aims, I, along with a team of undergraduate and graduate students, undertook a comprehensive review of the past 5 years of relationship science literature. To do that, we focused on 5 relationship science specific journals. So those were the middle section of JPSP, Journal of Marriage and Family, Journal of Family Psychology, Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, and Personal Relationships. So we first took all of the articles published in these 5 journals over 2014 to 2018 inclusive, which was 1,629 articles in total. So we then honed that down to the papers that are specifically about romantic relationships. And we define that as papers that have a romantic relationship variable as the DV. So a lot of studies were about parenting or parent-child relationships, family cohesion, other types of relationships. We excluded those. And then studies that had a relationship variable as the IV. So lots of studies looking at, how does relationship quality predict BMI or depression or self-regulation, all of those sorts of things. We also excluded those. We wanted to focus on papers that are about what's happening in relationships, not about other things that relationships predict. Okay, so we ended up with 539 articles that included 750 unique studies. So those 750 studies make up the corpus that I'm going to be talking about from now on. With these 750 studies, and we had 2 undergraduate research assistants go through all of these studies and extract some data from them. So some things that were pretty clear that they could code, they just coded as a yes, no. So for example, is it an undergraduate sample? Is it an MTurk sample? They coded that information. Other things that were a little more complicated, they just extracted verbatim what was given in the manuscript. So things like income or race. And then 2 coders did every paper. Any discrepancies at all on any dimension was resolved by one of the graduate students on the team to leave us with a clean data set. So here are the things that the RAs coded when they read the papers. These were all things that they gave a yes, no. So like I mentioned, is it an undergrad sample? Is it an MTurk sample, nationally representative sample, community sample? Is it dyadic data versus individual data? And then they coded for method. So these could get a yes, no for any of these, whatever the paper used. So does it use self-report, observational, which includes video and audio, physiological data, administrative data. So that's things like, census records. And then a few things we couldn't really fit, like Facebook profiles. Some of those got in other category. And then they coded for design, and this one is mutually exclusive. So each paper was slotted, or excuse me, each study was slotted into one of these 4 designs. It was experimental, cross-sectional, longitudinal, or diary. And diary included daily diary, time diary, and EMA studies. And then these are the things that the RAs recorded for further cleaning and analysis. So the country of origin of the sample, the sexual orientation and gender identity of the participants, the income of the participants, and the race and or ethnicity of the participants. So turning to the results, and I'm going to start with that first aim, which is just describing what do we have, what do our samples look like. First of all, where do our samples come from? So across the 750 studies, we found that 73% within these 5 journals came from the US, and 27% came from countries outside of the US. And of those non-US papers, here's sort of the continent or region that they came from. So you can see the majority were from Europe. Next was North America, non-US North America. Essentially here means Canada. I think there was maybe 1 or 2 from Mexico. Australia, New Zealand, Asia, which was primarily China, and then 1 each from South America and Africa. So we had a pretty good proportion of studies from outside the US, but most of those are from other Western countries. The minority are from non-Western countries. Okay, turning now to what our samples look like. Starting with sexual orientation and gender identity. First of all, we found that 31% of studies didn't report any information about the sexual orientation or gender identity of their participants. These were pretty much studies that used individual data. So these are individuals who are in a relationship and they don't assess that individual's sexual orientation or the gender of the person that they're in a relationship with. For most of the dyadic studies, they didn't assess or report these things specifically, but we were able to ascertain it typically because the participants are referred to as husband and wife or male, female. So we got the information there. But 31% didn't tell us anything about this at all. But of the ones who did, we recorded the percent of the couples in the sample who were same-sex couples or included a transgender partner. Then we coded those into 2 different categories. So they were an exclusive sample if the sample was 100% one of these categories. Then they were an oversample if they had more than 30% of their participants in one of these categories. 30% is a little bit arbitrary, but when looking at the data, it was pretty clear that this was the line. Below 30 were just studies with 1 or 2 or 3% same-sex couples who had just been sampled incidentally. So studies that intended to oversample were all in the 30, 40, 50% range. Okay, so of the 514 studies that reported on this information, we found that 97% of the studies were about different sex couples. 1.4%, 7 studies total, were 100% same-sex couples. 8 studies had an oversample of same-sex couples, and then 2 studies total were about couples, exclusively couples with a transgender partner. Okay, turning to race and ethnicity. Once again, we found a large amount of missing data here. 34% of studies didn't report anything about the race or ethnicity of their participants. For those that did, we recorded what the authors reported about the percent of their sample who fell into different race and ethnicity categories. For some papers, this was very complete and very fine-grained with a lot of categories. With other papers, it was more, more like X% of participants were non-white. So in order to, harmonize across all of those, we had to go with the largest possible grouping. So we collapsed it into percent of the sample who were white and percent of the sample who were non-white. And of course, I just want to recognize that like this non-white category includes tons of different kinds of people, right? This is a very, very heterogeneous category. This was the only way we could really kind of clean this data. So we took those 2 numbers and we coded every sample into one of 3 groups based on a rule of thirds. So if more than 2/3 of the sample was non-white, we called it primarily non-white. If it was between 1/3 and 2/3, we said it was a mixed or a diverse sample. And if less than 1/3 was non-white, we called it a primarily white sample. And I should say here that for these, we only coded the US papers. So of course, in other countries, there's going to be different racial and ethnic groups. It's going to mean something different to belong to each of those groups. So this is focused on the US papers who provided data to allow us to code them, which was 416 studies. Of those 416 studies, we found that 68% focused on a primarily white sample, 21% had a mixed or diverse sample, and 11% had a primarily non-white sample, which is 2/3 or more of their participants were non-white. And finally, for participant descriptives, socioeconomic status, we indexed this with participant income. Then we unfortunately found that 76% of studies didn't report income. Huge amount of missing data on this one. But for those that did, we recorded everything from the paper about income and household size. We calculated the percent of the sample who fall below 200% of the federal poverty line, which is sort of the generally agreed upon line for being considered low income. Just for context, that's currently about $50,000 for a family of 4 is the line for being low income. So we calculated, percent of the sample that's low income, percent of the sample that's not low income. Once again, this was only US studies. Again, income, currency across countries is going to be different. So focused on US studies. And then we again coded them using that rule of thirds. So more than 2/3 low income was primarily low income. Between 1 and 2/3 was a mixed income sample. Less than 1/3 was a primarily middle class sample is what we called it. So this one we had only 150 studies to draw from. So of those 150 US studies, we found pretty similar things to race and ethnicity. So 65% were a middle class sample. 25% had a mixed income, a diversity of socioeconomic status in their sample, and 10% focused on a primarily low income sample. So 2/3 or more of their sample was low income. So overall, across those 3 categories, there was actually some overlap between them where some papers fell into multiple of those categories. So we had 17 primarily about sexual orientation and gender identity minorities, 46 primarily about racial or ethnic minorities, and 15 primarily about low-income couples for a total of 67 studies that were primarily about these underrepresented groups. To give you an idea of where these papers came from across the journals that we sampled, so the full bar is the number of studies out of the 750 that came from that journal. The orange portion represents the proportion of those studies that are one of those underrepresented studies. You can see the highest was Journal of Family Psychology. 18% of studies published in that journal were focused primarily on an underrepresented group. On the low end, we had personal relationships and JPSP with 4% of their studies. Okay, so now turning to aims 2 and 3. where I focus on those 67 studies that were about primarily underrepresented groups. And first, we wanted to look at the research methods and designs being used in these studies. So here, this is the descriptors for the full sample. So of all 750 studies, dyadic data was a little bit more common than individual data across the literature. When we break this down in those two groups, so underrepresented versus not underrepresented, you can see that the dyadic portion gets a little bit smaller for the papers focused on underrepresented groups. That is a statistically significant difference. So the studies using underrepresented samples were significantly less likely to use dyadic data. Looking at research methods, again, this is the descriptors for all the studies. So of 750 studies, 740 of them use self-report in some way. The few that didn't, did something like linking observational and physiological data together or something like that. And then beyond that, all of the other methods were actually pretty rare in general across the studies. So 11% used observational data and 2% or less used physiological, administrative, or other types of methods. And when we look at underrepresented versus not underrepresented studies, we didn't find any difference here. They're no more or less likely to use any of these methods. Now looking at research design, so again, every study was coded into one of these categories. Of all the 750 studies, you can see cross-sectional was the most common design, followed by longitudinal, then experimental, then diary. When we test these against each other, see that the cross-sectional section stays pretty unchanged. For the underrepresented studies, the longitudinal section grows quite a bit and the experimental and diary become smaller. And this is again a statistically significant difference. So studies about underrepresented samples were more likely to be longitudinal and less likely to be experimental or diary. And then finally, we wanted to know what types of questions are being answered in these studies. So to do that, we had to go back to those 67 papers and code the research questions that were being asked in those papers. We coded them into 3 different categories. So the first is it a basic science question? Here's an example of one of those. We test how stress relates to effective communication between romantic partners. All right, that could be asked in any sample. The next type was generalizability. So here's an example of one. Say, we examined whether similarity, complementarity, accuracy, and positive illusions exist within the sex lives of same-sex romantic couples. So things that we already know exist in couple relationships, do these exist in same-sex couple relationships? And then finally was a specific research question. So the question is specific to this sample. So there's 2 different examples of how that might show up. First one says, we examine how minority stress uniquely affects the relationships of Black couples. So as a sample that's 100% Black couples looking at something specific to their experience. And the next example, we will test whether the association between relationship functioning and health differs between same-sex and opposite-sex couples. So you can see here that was one that had an oversample of same-sex couples in order to compare with opposite-sex couples. And of course, studies could have multiple research questions. So some of the studies got multiple of these codes assigned. So looking first at the 17 studies that were about sexual orientation and gender identity minority couples, you can see there were 5 basic research questions, 3 generalizability questions, and 14 specific questions. So primarily questions specific to this relational experience. There were no specific other questions. I'll tell you what that means in just a minute. Here for the 15 papers that focused primarily on low-income couples, so again, 2/3 or more of their sample were low income. We see here it tipped more towards basic questions, 8 basic questions, no generalizability questions, 4 specific questions, 3 specific other questions. And what that means is, as I mentioned, some of the studies fell into multiple categories. So these were papers that were in multiple categories. Their question was specific to one of the other groups. So a question specific to being non-white or specific to being with a transgender partner, but not specifically about being low income. And then for the 46 papers that focused primarily on non-white couples, you can see it was, again, majority basic questions, 29 basic questions, 2 generalizability, 15 specific, and 2 specific other. Okay, so that was a lot of results. So I want to sum them up for you before I move on to some thoughts and recommendations. So overall, we saw that a very small proportion of the papers focused specifically on underrepresented samples. So of the 750 studies, less than 10% were about any of these particular underrepresented groups. And we also saw that many papers didn't even collect or report on many of these descriptives, ranging from a third to 3/4 missing data on kind of basic demographic descriptives about the samples. And of course, those percentages that I'm giving assume that the papers that didn't report descriptives are not about one of those underrepresented groups. When looking at the studies that focus specifically on underrepresented groups, we saw that they were more likely to use individual versus dyadic data, more likely to be correlational, either cross-sectional or longitudinal, rather than experimental. But they're equally likely to use all of the research methods that we looked at. In reality, methods other than self-report were just rare in general across all of the studies. Again, 11% used observational, 2% or less used anything else. And when we looked at the research questions being asked in the studies of underrepresented groups, we saw that they were primarily basic questions for the non-white and low-income samples, whereas for the sexual orientation and gender identity minority samples, they were primarily specific questions about those relationships. So based on these results, I want to offer a few recommendations. And the first one, I'm going to start with the lowest hanging fruit. I think this should be pretty easy for all of us to achieve, which is to collect and report on our demographic descriptives. So if we were even just to see complete demographic descriptives going forward, that would already be a huge improvement. Then we would actually know who we're studying with more accuracy. So beyond people individually committing to do this, I think one way that would ensure that it happens and also actually help us sort of organize and clearly report this data would be for some of our journals to adopt guidelines for the necessity of doing this and for how to do it. It's similar to what we've seen with journals adopting requirements or incentives for open science practices. We've now seen those things increasing quite a bit. And so this would be something maybe like a table or a template to be filled in, similar to NIH grant applications. It doesn't even necessarily have to be in the manuscript. This could be something that gets posted with the online supplement. Every single paper just has one. They're all reported in the same way. So just some thoughts there for how that would be done. But I do think that these need to be actually relationship science specific guidelines. So, as all of us know, when you start working with dyadic data, things get complicated really quickly. And it turns out that that's true even just of reporting basic descriptives. So, in doing this work, we saw most of the descriptives reported separately for males and females, or husbands and wives, things like this, right? That's sort of how things go in the literature. How do we then incorporate in when we're studying same-sex couples? Or do we want to maybe see crosstabs so we can tell how many interracial couples there are? Because right now we get the racial breakdown of only each partner, but not of the couple dyad. Or how should we report income? If they're living together or married, it's household, but if they're living separately, then they maintain 2 households. It gets really complicated really quickly. And so we saw things reported very, very differently across all the papers. So some guidelines on how to standardize this with, of course, still flexibility to deal with different types of situations. So I'll summarize this recommendation as just, collect and report on what you're already doing, right? You don't even change what you're doing, just tell us more about what it is that you're actually doing. The next step beyond that, of course, is to broaden the type of research that we're doing. So in the studies of underrepresented groups, we did look at the frequency of the different types of research questions, but actually I don't want to make too much of those results because the number of studies was just so small, right? So in reality, we need more of all 3 of those types of research questions being asked in groups that have been underrepresented in our field. We need more basic questions, more generalizability questions, and more specific questions about people who have been left out. I talked a lot today about these types of specific samples and specific studies, but I also don't want to overlook the value in having the types of diverse and mixed samples that we also coded for, right? The ones that were a little bit more common than the specific samples. And in particular, I think it's really important that our basic research should be occurring in those types of samples, right? Samples that reflect the population better. Because if we're going to conduct basic research and say that these things are basic tenets of relationships, then they shouldn't be coming from specific samples, right? They should be coming from more diverse samples that are reflective of the population. So right now, I think what we've seen is that we have too many specific samples, specifically of white, straight, middle-class couples, right? When the US population, 40% is non-white, 30% is low income, just for example. So, I think that we should be striving for our samples to be reflective of that diversity that we see in the world around us. Oh, why? Why do we need to do this? Why do I think we should do this? So beyond just believing in diversity and inclusion as a value in and of itself, having limited samples actually means that we're limiting the knowledge in our field. So when we start to challenge our basic assumptions about what's true about relationships, then we actually find some really, really interesting things. Just one example, Jackie Ross and colleagues published a paper in JPSP not too long ago showing that the demand withdrawal pattern of communication that we long believed was bad for relationships is actually adaptive for couples living in a low SES context. Take another example. If we think about non-Western cultures, which we didn't see very represented in our samples, one of the defining features of interdependent versus independent cultures is how people relate to others. But we actually know relatively little about how those differences play out specifically in romantic relationships. Two other variables that we actually collected that I haven't been able to analyze yet, so I didn't talk about today, are age and education of our samples. So we know, for example, that more older adults than ever are entering new relationships right now. We also know that in the US, there's really big differences in the timing and stages of relationship and family formation across education. So older adults, non-college educated adults, these are both places where we could learn so much more about the early stages of attraction, mate selection, and relationship formation. So I think that we could very quickly make huge leaps forward in our knowledge if each of us thought about, what's your favorite theory, your favorite phenomenon that you like to research. Think about some of these dimensions or others. Do you think that theory or phenomenon would generalize across these dimensions? Or do you think there are places where it might operate differently? It might not fully account for what's going on in those relationships. And then why not test that hypothesis that you just came up with? So if you find that it generalizes, then that's great, right? Then, when my students ask, is this true for people who are X, Y, and Z? I can say, yes, it is. We've tested it. We know that that's true. And if it doesn't generalize, then that's also great because now we've learned something totally new about how relationships work. So I'll wrap up just by giving this final thought. I think we've seen that there are important populations and phenomena that we're missing in our field. And that means that we're limiting the robustness of our basic science and our ability to inform applied work in some of the ways that we just talked about in this conversation right before this. I want to thank and recognize all of the undergraduate and graduate students who worked really hard on this project. And thank you all for having me.